Hi, I'm Shabazz Stuart. I'm from a place just north of here called Brooklyn, and I'm going to embrace vulnerability today and just say that I am very nervous right now. I don't think I've ever spoken in front of a group of such distinguished folks, and I certainly have never been asked to give any sort of keynote address. So please bear with me and my nerves, but I'd like to start by extending a warm thanks to the folks at Transportation Camp for having me, and to the folks at Smart Growth America for hosting me as well, and to all of you who I hope to meet during the course of the day. My own journey started in 2018 with a simple question: where am I going to park my bike? Parking your bike should be as easy as parking your car or riding the subway or hailing an Uber. And that year, I decided to use my own experience in the public sector to create an experiment with a bundle of solutions. We eventually named that Oonee. Today, we're building the nation's first regional network of free-to-use public bike parking and charging stations. We will have 12 in operation by the end of this quarter, and by the end of next year, 45 in operation throughout the greater New York and New Jersey metropolitan region. But I am not here today to speak about bike parking. Rather, I'd like to address and discuss one of the most common questions that I receive. Folks say to me, Shabazz, shouldn't this be the domain of government? Why do we need a private company operating a public service? Shabazz, we don't need more entrepreneurs. We need government to take more responsibility. This is a good question. It's an important question, and it's one that merits a profound amount of discussion. It strikes at the core of who we are as transportation advocates and activists, and our shared purpose in the work that we're doing together. What we must foremost realize is that as entrepreneurs, that entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship have constituted a vital part of the transportation ecosystem since the founding of this nation. It was an entrepreneur named Robert Fulton who worked with government to launch the first viable steamboat service between New York City and Albany. It was an entrepreneur named Theodore Judah, and other entrepreneurs who worked with him, who worked with government to launch the nation's first transcontinental railroad. August Belmont and other entrepreneurs worked with government to build the first modern subway system in the country. Howard Hughes and other entrepreneurs worked with government to launch the nation's aviation system. Entrepreneurs worked together with government to build carriage routes that would evolve into tram routes, that would evolve into trolley routes, that would eventually become bus routes. And y'all, this is very important to me. The dynamic duo of John and Emily Roebling, two entrepreneurs working together in partnership with government to design and construct the Brooklyn Bridge, and in the process, change the destiny of a city. The historic partnership between government and entrepreneurs is responsible for so much of the transportation infrastructure that we enjoy and even take for granted today. Individuals who are among the foremost experts in their fields, taking enormous risks and dedicating their lives and their legacies to the tradition of true innovation that once led the world. And friends, brothers and sisters, that tradition today is broken. I cannot blame those who are skeptical. I cannot blame those who are disenchanted of late. We have generally, as entrepreneurs in the transportation space, not been worthy of much acclaim or praise. Let's be honest, in the past decade, we've seen some haphazard, crazy, and bizarre ideas from venture-backed entrepreneurs. We've got folks who think they're going to revolutionize urban transportation by dropping a few scooters on the street and then walking away. We've got folks who think they're going to solve transportation congestion, traffic congestion, by having a fleet of a few flying taxis that'll whiz you from one place to the other. We've got other folks out there that think that the answer to traffic congestion is by building underground highways and little tunnels that hold Teslas. I won't name names. The word innovation has become shorthand for dismissing expertise, for dismissing efficacy, for dismissing generations of learned best practices. All too often, transportation entrepreneurship has become less about building a legacy of change and more about getting rich very quickly. Taking the easy route, blitz scaling bad ideas. It's less about making a difference and it's more about greed. And the truth is, ironically, they ain't making that much money. Some of these companies are penny stocks, again, not naming names. Others are no longer in business. Some of these folks have gone on to other sectors, cryptocurrency. And as the tide of venture capital and money recedes back into the ocean, we're left with missed opportunities and broken promises. Missed opportunities for social change, missed opportunities for transforming our cities, for building equitable communities, for helping to stave off some of the worst effects of climate change, for missed opportunities for economic mobility. Friends, brothers, and sisters, we need new blood in this space. We need a new breed of transportation entrepreneur for the 21st century. We need to restore together the promise of what it means to be a reformer, of what it means to be a visionary. We need folks who recognize that true innovation is less about making a fast buck on bad ideas and more about bringing financial sustainability and scale to the good ones. We need folks that are committed to efficacy. We need the true believers. We need the people who know what works. We need the experts. We need the activists that want to get down and dirty in the trenches. We need to get relentless champions that are going to fight for good ideas. We need people like the folks in this room right now, the folks who are watching this broadcast, the folks who have made transportation their lives work. I still believe in the power of the civic entrepreneur. There is so much good that we can do. But if we are to be honest, we have let the wrong people take up too much oxygen for too long. There are a few trailblazers that we can look to for inspiration, gleaming rays of light in the darkness that can help guide us through the journey. 20 years ago, few people had heard of the concept of bike share. The idea that publicly owned bikes would line our streets seemed utterly fantastical. The folks at Alta knew better. They had the vision, the know-how, the dexterity to imagine, conceptualize a better urban future. Together with the government of Montreal, they launched Bixi, the first modern bike sharing scheme that would combine infrastructure, technology, good planning to bring public on-demand bike share to millions of people. Now, Alta wasn't founded by some Silicon Valley rich kid. These were experienced planners. And as they scaled their model to cities across the globe, they embraced expertise at every turn. When Alta became Motivate, they hired Jay Walder, the former head of New York's MTA and Hong Kong's MTR, as their CEO. When they became Lyft, they hired folks like Laura Fox and Caroline Sampanaro, who were veterans of transportation planning and advocacy. They worked in partnership with government, with advocates, with communities to make bike sharing mainstream. They would be relentless and they would be uncompromising. In Montreal, they introduced the notion that durable year-round bikes could support year-round cycling, even in the public format. In Washington and New York, they embraced the notion that network density could result in higher ridership. They knew from experience that this would enable rapid adoption and would yield to shorter trip times. In Boston, they were able to work with 8 different municipalities to achieve regional scale. Today, their thoughtful model is considered the gold standard in cities across the globe. You can see the fruits of their labor right outside this conference hall. It is no accident that this progress came from experts and advocates, the folks that care. Y'all, we need more people like them in entrepreneurship. If you've grown up or ever been to or ever lived in the immigrant enclaves of New York, you've probably heard of dollar vans. These sometimes haphazard and chaotic minibus services provide transportation to hundreds of thousands of people in our communities each day. They're a vital complement to the city's subway and bus system. As the city's mostly white planning and advocacy community regarded these services as a nuisance, Sue Sani saw an opportunity to organize and streamline and modernize this ecosystem. As the son of Nigerian immigrants growing up in Bed-Stuy, he knew firsthand how valuable these services could be. His lived experiences enabled him to see not just underserved communities, but an under-realized asset. With his background in technology as a foundation, he launched Dollaride, an app-based platform that would bring together communities, city officials, and would organize this patchwork of small businesses into one cohesive ecosystem, one platform. Today, he's working with New York officials to not only bring dollar vans to transit deserts across the entire state, but to electrify their fleets as well. Sue still lives in Bed-Stuy, and he's committed to this work in large part because he wants to make his own community a better place. He saw an opportunity where the venture capitalists didn't. This work isn't always headline grabbing, nor does it attract the headlines of the international tech media, but it's actually improving the lives of countless people in communities of color, and soon in communities across the state. We need more people like Sue. We are about to embark upon a decisive chapter in human history. What kind of world will we leave to those who come after us? What will be our legacy? Will we leave our children and their children flooded cities, nations besieged by famine, ensnared in an endless climate crisis? Or will we leave them a world that is rich and full of life? Will we leave them cities and communities that are fit for people? To those who say, we don't need entrepreneurs, we need government, I say we need all hands on deck for this moment. We all need to be in the arena together. We need to fight at every level, in the public office, in the bureaucracies, in advocacy, and yes, in the private sector, in the corporate boardrooms, in venture capital. We need civic entrepreneurs who are committed to real solutions that make a real difference at every level. Now is not the time to abdicate our role as advocates. Now is not the time to give up on this space. Now is not the time to yield. We must be bold, we must be brave, we must be courageous, and we must be relentless. This is the moment for a new generation of civic entrepreneur, of entrepreneurial leadership. For advocates, for all the activists, for all of us who care deeply about transportation, this is the time to fight. As many of you know, transportation is much more important than just lines in a map. It's about building something much more profound than materials and machinery. It's not just about infrastructure, nor is it about technology. It's not just about optimizing trip times. Transportation is the connective tissue that binds our society together. So some say entrepreneur, I say change agent. If we prevail at this moment, at this juncture as change agents, I'm convinced that our legacy will be one that instills pride. Not just within us, but within all those who come after us. Thank you. So I think we've got time for a few questions. I'm super excited for a discussion. There was supposed to be a video, but there was no video, so threw me a little bit off. But
anybody have any questions?
One is, what common data platform will you our support as we move toward Keynote, providers and trips? And the second is a plan. When cities, et cetera, procure topic, how far should they go or refrain from? Basically saying, this is the end result I want with accessibility, with the other thing, but not getting your business into how you do it.
what's your name? Oh, okay. I was going to say it one more time, it sounds like. Okay.
Okay, that.
Can you also just say your name as well? All right.
I'm Steve Yaffe, ymobility.info. First question is data. What common data format standards would you, for your business, and I'm thinking as Sue at Dollaride does great stuff, be willing to adhere to as we move towards intermodal, multi-provider linked trips for planning and payment? And then the second one is on procurement. What should be the boundary when a city or MPO issues an RFP and say, this is the end goal and it's got to be accessible and meet these standards, but what's the point in which they should stop getting into telling you how to do it?
Okay, Steve, thank you so much. A, for the kind words, and B, for the couple of questions. So I'm going to embrace again vulnerability and say that as a consequence of the dynamic that we find ourselves in at this moment, it's been hard for companies like ours to raise lots of money. Sue's a good friend of mine. I can speak for myself. Venture capitalists have just not really gushed at the idea of hard work and hard problems and long time horizons. And so as a result, we haven't been able, on our side, we've been mainly a hardware company until this year. We're still building our app. We've had to stagger out our product roadmap to 5 years. And we've watched with a little bit of quiet envy as other companies that are now penny stocks have really been able to scale relatively quickly their entire vision. And so that's my way of saying that we don't have any common data standards. We don't even have an employee on staff that's dedicated to answering that question. We're just now building our own app ecosystem. I can't speak for Sue because Dollaride is much more tech driven than Oonee at this point. But it's a question that we're now just starting to appreciate. For example, we used to, when people signed up, collect IDs as a way of verification, and someone came on the team and said, "Oh, no, you can't do that because you can't collect, private information." That's, so we were in remediation up until, when it came to data, up until 6 months ago, really. So we're now just starting to have those conversations. With respect to the second question, which is really an important one, for those of you in the room who are not familiar with the procurement process, I like to say that broke is, hey, we need better city services. Woke is, we need a better procurement system. We need to reform our procurement system, because the reason why things don't get done in cities is a broken procurement process. I cannot tell you how many cities have approached me and said, we'd love to have Oonee in our community. We love a network. We buy the vision. And then they go back and it's like, well, we're hearing from our department that we got to do an RFP and it's going to take 3,000 hours and we're going to have we got to have legal approve it. And by the time we go through that process, I mean, people wish they were dead. I mean, it's the kind of thing that, no, I mean, look, and Jersey City released and adjudicated the nation's first secure bike parking RFP. So that was a milestone that quietly made a little bit of history. The city announced the RFP or announced the intention of doing an RFP as early as 2019. They were looking at it, they were studying it. Released the RFP in November of 2020, awarded the RFP in February of 2021. We adjudicated the contract together and the city council ratified the contract in November of 2021. And now we're just starting to manufacture, we're manufacturing the first 8 stations that are going to be deployed in March of this year, 2023. So from 2019 till 2023 is that time horizon, and that's a relatively small municipality. So to answer your question directly, I actually think I think change agents can occupy important roles at every level of the ecosystem. So we need folks in government to operate in lockstep with folks in the private sector. And we need folks who are savvy, that can understand what makes the private sector folks tick. And they need to say, look, here's the vision for what we want. I don't think cities should back away and say, no, let the private sector drive the conversation. I think the city should say, we want these kinds of services, and this is how we want it to work. When I go to investors, you cannot believe how many times we have a conversation where investors are like, yeah, but I'm not sure the city wants that. And do you really think the city is going to cooperate here? Do you really think the city's interested? And when a city comes out and says, no, this is our vision, this is what we want, it makes my life a lot easier. I can say, look, this is something that there's a market for. And I think it actually diminishes risk for all involved. I think it diminishes risk for the city. We have bad ideas that get weeded out. And I actually think it diminishes risk for the private sector. My one asterisk would be, I do think that cities and staffers in the bureaucracies must have an open line of communication with entrepreneurs in the private sector for 2 reasons. One, you got to know who the bad actors are and the good actors are, right? Not everyone's on equal footing. There are people, I think those of us who've been in government, we all know who they are, that come into our offices and they know what they're talking about. And we don't want to trust them to get projects done. And there are people who are true believers, who are, advocates in the space that want to do the right thing and are willing to take risks to get there. But also you need to know what the business models are. There are so many times where a city will say, look, I've got an RFP, I got an opportunity here, but it's just not workable from a financial standpoint. And I can't provide a service if the numbers don't pencil. And, folks will say to me, Shabazz, like, do we have these public-private partnerships, it's not I don't care if it pencils for the private company. Why do I care if they make money? You have to care because it's a partnership and you're dancing together. You always got to know what makes your partner tick. Otherwise, you're both going to end up in a very scary place.
Hi, thank you so much. You actually answered a lot. My name is Mary Jo Gellenbeck. I'm an advocate from.
I know you from Twitter.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in from Raleigh, North Carolina, and we do have a city that is focused on increasing the multimodal experience, so that potentially because we have high growth coming in, and we understand this car dependency system that we have isn't going to work. So I'm very interested in the Oonee. I've been watching you guys for a while, and I was curious, how available already are you to expand and provide the product to cities that are interested? And
Yeah.
and if you are in that capacity, how do advocates bring you to the staff
Yeah.
and city council so that they know who you are?
So that's a great question. And actually, we get a lot of emails from folks that say, hey, can we bring this network to our city? When we launched the company, our goal initially was to find partners in the New York, New Jersey region. We've done that. We've got a few more partners we're hoping to bring into the fold. But in 2020 and 2019, we started to say, okay, we need partners nationally. And we started talking to cities across the country. And the challenges for a team, we have 4.5 people on staff. So for a small team, when a city says, yes, we're interested, what happens next is about a 2-year sales cycle where we've got to work with them to identify locations. We've got to work, we got to work with them to get the design right, to figure out how to usher this procurement process through the bureaucracy. And unfortunately, with the staff of 4, you got to figure out very quickly, what opportunities are real and what opportunities are not, right? And that's not saying, no, we're not ever going to get to other opportunities. It's saying we have a staff of 4, and if you pick the wrong one, we'll be out of business very quickly. And so right now, we've elected to focus primarily on materializing New York and New Jersey. We've got 45 stations that we have to build. And there's a lot of risk there. Like, I've got to convince investors that, these stations are profitable, that they pencil, they have advertising on them, and that the city's not going to, that city, it's going to tolerate them, and the public's going to like them. They're not going to ask us to leave. And then I've got to convince investors to give me the resources to build a bigger team to expand elsewhere. For perspective, we don't have anyone on staff right now that's dedicated to business development. So there's no one on the team right now that spends all their time focusing on other opportunities. We kind of share that responsibility. So it's a yes or no. It's more like we're interested, but bandwidth wise, we really have to find at this juncture slam dunks, because the slam dunks are what say to the other markets, no, this is something that you should do. Now, I mentioned Alta and Bixby. That was exactly their model. Alta was a great idea led by phenomenal people, and they didn't raise a lot of money at all. And actually, they eventually go out of business. Well, they eventually have to fold, and they have to be basically reformed by Motivate. We believe that if we can win in New York, which in many ways is, one of the world's leading media markets, we can show an example to other cities and get the bureaucracies, the elected officials, the policy leaders on board engaged. And then just like Alta did with Montreal, they went to London, and then they went to Washington, and then they went to New York. And then it was the tipping point where all of a sudden they're in 300 cities. We believe there's a very similar likelihood that will be the Oonee model, the Oonee experience. And so to answer your question very directly, I think the time horizon is probably next year for when we can see true scale in other smaller regional markets, for sure.
Hold on,
You have a mic,
hold on,
or-
hold on.
Oh.
We got virtual questions
Okay.
here. So I got two of them. First one's from Sally Gellert from the chairperson of the Lackawanna Coalition. And she asked, this was an earlier conversation about the collaboration between government and private sector. And they asked, where does the populace fit in when entrepreneurs and government collaborate? And I have one other question from Rachel. She has noticed that the bike advocacy and bike businesses tend to be mostly men. Some, not all, of these men are very dismissive and disrespectful of women and walking. How do you make sure your business does not do that?
I don't understand the first question. So what do you mean by populace?
General population. So John and Jane Q. Public, how did they get involved when private sector and government are collaborating? Community engagement.
Yeah, I mean, so I was a poli-sci major at Tufts, and I am a believer in, I'm a purist when it comes to how the structures of government should work. I think the public is involved through electing government officials. I think government should be and must be responsive to the general public. And the problem is that, there have been a lot of public-private partnerships where at the bureaucracy level, we've seen staffers just not be very knowledgeable about some of these companies. And we've seen companies not frankly be very interested in producing, efficacious solutions. And so those two combinations, or that combination together can create a very toxic framework for change. You've got governments that just don't understand how the numbers work, and you've got companies that are making bad decisions at every level, and you have a subpar product. I can't fix democracy. So, that's the question there really is, how do we make democracy work? And that is a question that January 6th was yesterday. We're kind of really answering at every level, but that's a question that is kind of beyond my pay grade. The second question, I got to step back as a man myself, as a team, which is mostly men. That's a huge problem in our community. We have a mostly white, mostly male space. In the case of Sue, he was dismissed not only by venture capitalists, but he was dismissed by planners and government officials. Said dollar vans suck. We don't need any more dollar vans. We got to get rid of those dollar vans. And he had a kind of steep road to climb in convincing people that, hey, just because they're shabby and just because they kind of are a little bit roly-poly doesn't mean that they don't serve real people and they don't deserve to be treated as a legitimate transportation form. And he would say to me, like, if these were like shinier buses that had like some companies have started to do, right, in the private sector, they're venture backed, maybe people will respect them more. And if people who rode those shiny buses were a different pigmentation, maybe people would respect them more. And so what we need is, we need more representation among advocates in the private sector space, in the bike space, in the micromobility space. I will give a huge shout out to the folks at Lyft, who I know are our sponsors today. So A, thanks for sponsoring, and B, thank you for including women at every level of system management. Laura Fox, A, who's just dynamic and great, but is also a woman. Caroline Samparnaro, a woman. And when it comes to questions about like how to design the right bike, how to make sure that you've got messaging that appeals to both genders, that having women at every level of that conversation leads to better representation. So I can't solve that question as a man. We need to have women in the conversation and in the boardroom and every level of product design.
Hey, Shabazz.
Hey.
I'm David Zipper. I'm visiting
who you are.
fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and I write a lot about transportation. And my question's about the potential to make money in transportation. It's Karina Ricks, the former head of transportation in Pittsburgh, former executive at DOT, US DOT, likes to say nobody makes any money in transportation. And we forget that. She talks about, like you mentioned, a lot of these companies like Uber and Lyft are learning the hard way that you can subsidize transportation with VC money, but eventually those chickens come home to roost, like with the scooter companies. But also, you mentioned Bixie, the bike share company that went bankrupt. I'm not sure you mentioned that. part.
I said they were in some trouble, but.
Yeah, they went bankrupt. No, so my question, and the exception, obviously, the car companies, which
Yeah.
of course they're massively, as people here know, subsidized implicitly, right? With we don't have to go into it, but with the more new mobility services, I'm curious your thoughts about like sort of like, does this house believe nobody can actually make serious money?
Yeah.
Without getting huge subsidies, one or the other, probably from VCs.
Charles.
Okay, so foremost, David, I'm a big fan. So just want you to know that. But I'm not sure that's true. And there's several layers to that question. And I said this in the remarks, but innovation right now is kind of regarded as we are gonna take, what are C and D ideas, and we're gonna make a lot of money on those C and D ideas. That's the innovation. I think we take A ideas and figure out how to make those A ideas make money and make them sustainable. I'm convinced that's possible. So that's, the idea, the notion that transportation is a money loss, a money pit, isn't accurate, because there are a lot of transportation adjacent companies that actually make quite a bit of money. So JC2Co, for example, JC2Co provides all the bus shelters in Boston, in New York, Clear Channel here in DC. They are not a transportation company, but out front in JC2Co, if you ride the metro or the subway or the T, you will see their ads, right? They are a significant player in the transportation space. When cities do these massive streetscape RFPs, New York is about to do one in 2 years, it's the advertising conglomerates that respond and manage those RFPs, because there's money to be made. Intersection is a new player. They in Philadelphia, they have a whole program they're rolling out, and they make a lot of money. We forget that, those guys, there's a whole ecosystem of folks who are transportation adjacent that build infrastructure that have figured out how to at least be sustainable. And, they sometimes, they're negotiating with cities, say, oh, we're broke, but they bid every time. When those RFPs come out, they're aggressive because they know they can make some money. In our case, we figured out very quickly that, the tolerance level for users to pay a fee, like this idea that cycling is going to be like car parking. We're going to, you pay $4 and you're going to pay $5 for park. That wasn't going to work. We were going to be broke very quickly. So we moved into kind of a real estate model where we would be monetizing on real estate. We would monetize through advertising. We'd monetize through the rights that we would associate with the real estate we were acquired, excuse me. And we would monetize with building an e-commerce framework that was basically a freemium model. And so that's my version of innovation, thinking about what at the core is transportation and how do we monetize on that. And now that sounds, oh, Shabazz, you're very naive. Okay, but MTR, Hong Kong, they are a real estate company, right? They provide transportation, but through transit-oriented development, they're able to actually build real estate portfolios, and that's how they make their money. They're the world's only profitable transportation company. So transportation, going back to that theme that I mentioned at the end of the remarks, is so much more valuable than just, oh, a line here, a line there. We provide value to society at every level, value capture, right? We literally power cities. This is how cities work. New York City can't function without transportation. And so I believe that the opportunity is, how do we make money on the value that we provide? And I will caveat my comments by saying, subsidization is value capture in its own way. It's government saying, you are very valuable. We don't go away. We're going to subsidize that operation. So this idea that because something is subsidized, it's not making any money, it's just providing any value, I think in itself is a little suspect. That's probably a deeper kind of conversation.
Hi, Lev Boone, and I'm a Master's of Urban Planning student at Georgetown, and I'm also, though, a public policy undergrad. And so, you as a political science undergrad, you understand, that political ideology, unfortunately, can play into a lot of the decision-making processes. And something I've seen through my career is that both sides of the political aisle have their issues with P3s. On On the right, it's that they don't want to see the public sector do anything, so they would prefer the private sector take on as much of the risk as possible. And in the process, they self-sabotage their own private sector venture. But on the other hand, you have people on the left who just inherently don't trust the private sector. As soon as you say there's going to need to be a profit component, it's, like you've just, spoken heresy. So my question basically is, how do we break through these ideological barriers to make it that we can get past the politics and get down to business, basically?
Great question. And it goes to the heart of, what my message is here, which is that we need to restore trust and credibility to the private sector. Again, I'm a broken record. I'm actually very shrill, and if you get to know me, I say the same thing over and over again. We haven't done, I come from the public sector. This is my first real private sector job. And, the more I'm into the space, the more I realize that we just haven't done a really good job in building solutions that work. The public has every right to distrust the private sector. I mean, we've seen so many bad ideas, right? And we've seen people who are know-nothings, acquire lots of power. And I think at some point, probably everyone in this room has wondered, like, holy crap, like, how could they do that? That doesn't work. So we need people like you to say, look, I'll be in the public sector, but I'm also not afraid to join the private sector, and not just, on the periphery, but with new ideas, taking concepts and theories and best practices that we know work, and figuring out, back to David's point, figuring out how we can make them sustainable.
How are you?
Figuring out how we can make them attractive to shareholders, figuring out how we can work together in partnership with municipalities to bring them to market. Now, with Oonee, when I started, one of the reasons that investors were not, and I'm going to use be euphemistic here, were not enthusiastic in our pitches, was because they didn't trust government. They said, oh, Shabazz, these government people, they're going to move slow and they're going to carve you up, right? And we don't believe that you're going to be able to work with these cities to like build infrastructure and real estate, certainly not with like $1 million, right? So no, we hard pass. And what we've shown with Oonee is, if you're able to acquire trust, if you're able to acquire the trust of the public at large, if you're able to acquire the trust of folks in government, people are willing to give you a little bit of a wider latitude. We've been able to work with the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, the MTA, the City of Jersey City, the New York City Department of Transportation, right? We've been able to work with, I can't say names, a number of other cities across the country, projects that are more of at a nascent stage. And in every level, we found people who are willing to do a lot of work that, in the words of one of our investors, they probably wouldn't do for Uber, or if it were a Bird, or if it were Lime, because the trust factor is there. They know that, I'll give you a quote from, I don't want to name names. So someone at SEPTA, who's pretty high up, who we had a conversation with over lunch. And this was a few years ago, and they were going to introduce me. This is March 5th. So, things went sideways very quickly, but 2020, but they were going to introduce me to their team of planners. And the guy who was with me said, oh, shouldn't you like make a formal introduction, and you shouldn't be there to help him understand, what they're saying? And the fellow said, no, they'll love each other. He's one of them, referring to me, right? Because I'm a true believer. And I think that if we have more true believers in the private sector proposing solutions that actually are efficacious, we can bridge that gap fairly easily. There's a real credibility gap, when it comes to how we operate in the private sector. And I think that's causing a lot of the friction. I think that progressives, I'm progressive. I'm a pretty leftist guy. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, I think that progressives are not opposed to public-private partnerships. They're opposed to bad public-private partnerships. And what we need to see is good models. Hey,
There we go. Hey, I'm Preston Judy. I'm a project manager with Grove Slade. Have you worked with any developers to meet their bicycle parking or TDM requirements that go with the entitlements processes for
Yeah.
their projects?
So great question. When Oonee started, I came from the bid world. So it's a little bit of I wasn't quite in the public sector. I also quite was in the private sector. The bids are, somewhere in between. I see myself more as a public sector actor. Our first a bid is a business improvement district. And so it's basically a CBO, a nonprofit 501c3 that operates and provides services on the local level. And they, in New York City, they are financed by a tax assessment on private property within the district. And the city, along with the private properties that are assessed, are on the board and so run the organization. So we were initially targeting developers because we felt that that would be the most expeditious way to bring projects to market. But the problem was that in the way, advertising particularly is a very, it's a highly regulated market. And so even with developers, we'd often end up back into a conversation with government. And in a few cases, we've had projects that have gone sideways. We had a few near-death experiences as a company. And we decided that we really were first a B2G company, second a B2B, business to developer company. And we had to master the regulatory framework and actually, frankly, get really political. Around 2019, we were like, okay, this is really a B2G, and business to government means, government's made up of a lot of consumers and a lot of citizens. So we got to really talk to the citizens and consumers and win their trust and tell people what we're doing. And that's how we would end up working with developers eventually. That's not us closing the door. We actually are working with a few large developers right now. But even in those large developers, and I'm going to not name names, but there's one case in particular where they're on a lease, one of those 100-year leases, and like EDC in New York has a say in what we do. So we actually have to, even with developers, have to talk to government as well. So it's a bit of a fluid spectrum, but yes, we are very interested in working with developers. Right now, the business plan revolves around achieving a footprint that makes the company sustainable. These next 8 or 9 stations that we build will join our existing portfolio and will mean the company is actually fully sustainable. We don't have to rely on, we're not default debt. All these companies are, if they don't get any venture capital money, they go out of business. We will be fully sustainable, and then we will raise some more money and take on more projects. And that's how we kind of see ourselves growing and eventually working with more developers.
Okay, so I'm going to bring a virtual question. And this is from, hopefully, please apologize. I apologize in advance, Dr. Rietzel and Rachel. Back to the earlier conversation about no money in transportation. And they wonder, like, car companies are able to turn a profit. So why should transportation be profitable?
This is a good question. We have to be, profit is treated as this kind of dirty word that, like, why are you, it's almost seen as exploitative. Like, you are making money on providing this public service. Like, you're taking advantage by extension of the citizens. You're looking to, get the best deal, and you're looking to cut corners because that optimizes profitability. And, as a result, we don't trust you, or we don't trust profits. So we get rid of the profits, we can somehow, restore trust to this space. That is not accurate. In fact, it's probably the opposite. One of the big problems with public-private partnerships is they're often structured in a way where the private sector partner can't turn a profit, and as a result, can't live up to the promises and is forced to cut corners and, forced to offboard people that are looking to do things in a manner that's copacetic to best practice. If you're going to attract, we got governments and we got bureaucracies that say, I'm going to attract private sector capital to solve this problem. We're going to not raise taxes. We don't have enough money to do this. So we're going to get the private sector to do it. Well, Shareholders, and many of you, I'm sure, have, retirement plans and maybe pension funds. Shareholders want to see a return. They're not giving you their money to have it make zero. If I go back to my board tomorrow and say, okay, we've raised about $4.5 million over our lifetime, over 4 years, which is not a lot of money. If I say we're going to return $4.5 million, I'll get fired. So if you're going to dance with the private sector, you have to understand the rationale that motivates the private sector is a rate of return. We are seeing our stations in New York are financed with project financing. We have to go find banks and investors that are willing to invest in our infrastructure. We're pitching them a 20% internal rate of return, which means they're going to see a 20% return. If I say, oh, it's going to be a 10% return, they're less interested. If I say 0, they're not interested at all. That's just how it works. It's not about, profit being dirty or profit, should it make a profit? It's just the nature of the capital. Everyone has a bottom line. In government, there's ROI as well. If we are going to build a highway, we're going to ask, how many people are going to use it? Will it pay for itself at some point? Will it be sustainable? May not be profitable. Will it be sustainable? That's a bottom line metric. In the private sector, will an investor see some appreciable return is a metric. And I think that government is better when it understands what makes their private sector partners tick. Now, an example I will offer is in New York City, I think one of the better cities for these public-private partnerships. JCDecaux has the bus shelter and newsstand contract. We've got several thousand bus shelters and newsstands. The city realized that, look, we got a lot of profitable real estate, valuable real estate. And if you build bus shelters in Manhattan, you got to build bus shelters in Staten Island. They knew that advertising companies were less interested in Staten Island because Staten Island isn't as valuable an advertising commodity as Manhattan. But the city realized that that was leverage because Manhattan is so valuable. So they were like, okay, Manhattan, you build one in Manhattan, you build 2 in Staten Island. Cities can leverage a profit-driven motive, if they're savvy about it, to advance the public good. When I talk to citizens, look, here's my bottom line. Here's how it works for you. Let's do-si-do and figure out how we can get to a place of alignment. I think profit-driven, a profit-driven partner is an opportunity, potentially. You just have to know how they make a profit, and what makes them tick.
All right, so like Wheel of Fortune, it's, lightning round now. It's the very end, the final spin, but I got 2 questions that we're going to try to fit in 4 minutes. So first question, go for it. If you can stand up and introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Max Gardner. So on the topic of trust, what advice would you give to public sector officials who have to draw the distinction, try and distinguish between the true believers and the snake oil salesmen? The heuristics that you use, or on the flip side, how do the private sector folks identify themselves, distinguish themselves as the true believers?
I honestly, and please cut me off, I'm long-winded, so just feel free to shut up. But I think right away, because I'm the kind of guy, I'm a transit nerd, so I'm the kind of guy who grew up, and I could tell you, look, we're riding on an R179 train in New York City, and this is when it was built, and that's just who I am. And I can tell you about the DC Metro, I can tell you about, hey, the 7000 series, that's getting a little bit up and down. And, when I meet people in government, they recognize fairly quickly that, I'm kind of a dork, and they understand that I really care about this stuff, maybe too much. And that helps them understand that I'm coming from a place of I'm a true believer. I really want to do this. And they also know that Oonee is not a $1 trillion business. It's the long way, it's the hard way. And so I wouldn't, you'd be kind of a glutton for punishment. And those 2 factors together, I think, help people understand that this is someone that wouldn't be here if they didn't really care about this stuff. I think you can spot that right away. When I was in the bid, when startups came to me, there are folks who were really good actors. Numina was a company that was one. I hear you. And, I could figure out, they are a great company. I could figure out folks who weren't so great. We could just 5 minutes of talking and asking them questions. Ask a lot of questions.
Hi, Christina Curtis. I feel like we've talked a lot about the relationship between government and business and not a lot about the user case. Local governments have seen resistance from residents when it comes to things like bike lanes, streetscapes, et cetera.
Yeah.
Curious how, if Oonee has seen some of that resistance as well to the infrastructure and how
Yeah.
you've dealt with it, and or how you see your role in helping local governments fight resistance to infrastructure development.
Okay, so great question. And I'm going to try to get you a short, brief, concise answer to the best of my abilities. You know, we had a near-death experience in 2019 where a lot of elected officials were like, people don't care about bike parking, so you're not a high priority. And it almost killed the company. And that was when I got on Twitter. And I decided that, you know, in order for us to really be effective, we needed to bring our message directly to the public, and particularly to advocates and activists and influencers. And we need to build our credibility with that group. And so we've actually flipped the script a little bit. Like we've got, you know, in New York, the narrative is, oh, community boards, you're going to get in so much trouble with the community boards. Like, how are you going to do? We've got community boards writing letters to City Hall saying, we want this. You know, CB4 wrote a letter saying we're okay with the bike parking and we're okay with the advertising too. CB6 filed, CB1 filed, we have CB8 in Brooklyn. You know, I think that we overthink this sometimes. What we fail to realize on both sides, private sector and public sector, is all too often we go into communities, especially communities of color, communities that have been historically marginalized, and we kind of like, hey, here's what's going to happen. And, you know, just letting you know, if you have any questions, just send us an email, right? You know, when you go into a space and you treat people like people, and, you know, sometimes you got to kiss the ring, right? Like people respond differently. And when you create solutions that actually address people's questions and concerns, you know, they respond differently. And there's so many, and we can talk offline, but there are a lot of examples in my journey where we've had people that were a little, you know, reticent. You're going to take away my parking space. And I said, look, like we have a whole variety of solutions, some that don't require us to take a parking space. Maybe we work together to figure out like how we can create capacity that lives alongside your parking, you know, and like at the very minimum, they're not mad, right? And they say, okay, fine, right? And that's where we can get to.